It was the largest classified military leak in history. Nearly 400,000 field reports painting a daily picture of the Iraq War between 2004 and 2009 revealed to the world.
You're clear. All right, firing.
Videos like this of U.S. soldiers shooting Iraqi civilians from a helicopter.
Come on, fire.
The Iraq war logs suggested the number of civilians killed was higher than reported, and that the U.S. military turned a blind eye to torture and abuse by American and Iraqi forces. The damning evidence was exposed by Private Chelsea Manning, who handed the documents and cables to the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. She was convicted under the Espionage Act and handed a 35-year sentence, later commuted by President Barack Obama.
Given she went to trial, due process was carried out, the sentence that she received was very disproportionate relative to what other leakers had received. It made sense to commute and not pardon her sentence.
7 years on, Chelsea Manning now walks free, a hero to those who wanted injustice brought to light. But the fighting in Iraq continues. So has the bloodshed. Iraqi forces are engaged with a new enemy, Daesh. Over the last year, a military campaign has steadily pushed its fighters out of cities like Ramadi, Fallujah, and Mosul. But rights groups say that with every battle, the tactics of old have resurfaced, where government forces and Shia paramilitary groups carry out revenge attacks on Sunni Arabs suspected of supporting Daesh.
I continually get reports of bodies cropping up. These are bodies that are found on the sides of roads, in the middle of places like East Mosul, in neighborhoods. Bodies that are men, their eyes are bound, their hands are bound behind their back, and nobody knows who put them there, how they got there, but they were very clearly in detention at the time that they were killed.
As part of the coalition fighting Daesh in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. has limited its role to training troops and launching airstrikes. Transparency activists have even welcomed the coalition's daily reports on its bombing campaign. Yet the monitoring project Air Wars believes civilian deaths are being underreported by as much as 90%. It finds that in the last 2 years, the coalition has conducted 14,200 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, with officials claiming only 152 civilian deaths. Air Wars thinks as many as 1,500 non-combatants died in that period. There's concern, too, that international players have been able to hide behind the front of a broad coalition.
We have seen that very little information is coming out when it comes to, for example, training of Iraqi forces, which forces, for example, the Americans are prohibited from training because there have been documented abuses, which they are using into other countries in order to support. Things like that, there's very little transparency.
And there's less photographic evidence of the abuses taking place as the perpetrators adapt to a new era of potential leaks. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Aki Peretz. He's a former CIA counterterrorism analyst. From Baghdad, Ahmed Rushdie, the director of the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation. And in San Diego, Iraqi-American author Ibrahim al-Marashi. He's in the history department at California State University. Thanks, all of you, for joining us. Aki, if I may begin with you, Chelsea Manning, heroic whistleblower or traitor?
Well, it's always it's difficult to say whether one person is one or another. But I think it's important for folks to understand that where Chelsea Manning began leaking and providing all this information, the United States was actually well on its way out of Iraq. Remember that he started his leaks in late 2009, early 2010. By that time, Barack Obama, who ran as specifically as an anti-war candidate, was already in the White House. We already had the status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government saying that we will pull out of, we'll withdraw all combat forces from Iraq by the end of 2011. And actually, even before Chelsea Manning had done a single thing, we had already pulled out U.S. troops from all Iraqi cities. And so we'd already pulled out and brought out a lot of information, a lot of material, equipment, people out of Iraq by 2010 or so.
So
Chelsea Manning
just for a second, just a second. So did the government then overreact, whether it was the White House, the DOD, or the State Department? Did they just all overreact to this because WikiLeaks had no impact on the Iraq war?
I think WikiLeaks had an accelerating impact on how people felt about the status of the Iraq war, at least here in the United States. But remember, by 2006, people in the United States, the public, if you look at polling, had decisively turned against the Iraq war. In 2006, if you look at the elections, the Democrats actually took Congress from the Republicans, specifically over anti-war issues, and it affected lots of Republicans across the country. So, for example, in my home state of Maryland, the governor lost because he was a Republican, not because of any real reason that he was anti or pro-Iraq war.
Okay, interesting point. So the leaks by Manning accelerated a process that was already happening. That's according to Aki Peretz. Ahmed Rushdie, you were in Iraq at the time. Tell me, what was the response on the ground in Iraq amongst Iraqis when those leaks came out?
Well, actually, the impact was very bad against the American forces, and the people get furious here and become to say, okay, we want you to get out of our country, which is actually supported the slogan of Mr. Maliki at that time, and also President Obama. But at the end, if it is wrong or right, the withdrawal of Iraq, because at the end we had Daesh. Right. And Daesh is actually presented in Iraq because of the emptiness of the real security forces that presented in the Iraqi soil. That means that what's happened at that time in 2010 actually was used by even the American administration at that time and the Iraqi administration at that time to push the withdrawal of the American forces outside Iraq, but at the same time, they didn't manage to have a plan to secure the Iraqi soil, and ended with Daesh. So I think we must, and now the Iraqis seeing themselves were framed in 2010.
So do you think they regret being...
They're asking the same question, why the American forces withdraw?
Okay, interesting. So do you think those who responded so angrily to say, get out of our country, especially when those leaks came out, when we saw the collateral murder video of the helicopter gunship shooting dead those people. So do you think the Iraqis regret being so angry at the Americans? Do you think that they wish the Americans were still in the country?
Well, instead of that, the Iraqis now wandering around. If the responsible men at that time should be accused of betraying their own country, because at the end they didn't have the right plan. I mean, the Prime Minister and his followers, the ministers at that time, they didn't have a plan, a real plan on the Iraqi soil to secure all of Iraq. So why you did push the American forces outside, and at the end you didn't fight Daesh. You didn't even get any resistance against Daesh, and Daesh took Mosul and Anbar and so many.
But undoubtedly, I mean, Daesh came up in 2012, and these things, you know, they're all interconnected, understandably. But there was a domino effect, right? Daesh wasn't around in 2006, 2007. Be that as it may, let me move to Ibrahim al-Marashi. Ibrahim al-Marashi, again, at the heart of all of this, what Chelsea Manning did and the global ramifications it had and the impact on Iraq, was it for the better, or did it cause more harm than good, Ibrahim?
I wouldn't say it caused any harm in that basically Chelsea Manning, she released documents that documented what the United States did in Iraq, but the U.S. was on its way out of Iraq at that time. So I can't see any harm. It wasn't like Afghanistan, where it was feared that the documents she released with Afghanistan, the Taliban would go look at them, see who was collaborating with the U.S. and hunt them down. By that time, the U.S. was more or less out of there. It just revealed basically the biggest harm, I would say, long-term was the State Department cables that Chelsea Manning had and uploaded. There it kind of revealed geopolitical sensibilities that usually the State Department liked to be kept quiet.
Right. I mean, and one of the jokes at the time was, oh my God, WikiLeaks showing that diplomats lie. Who'd have thought that? Now, Manning is a divisive person, divisive within the United States, lots of opinion, especially on social media. There was an interesting tweet at the time of the commuting of the sentence. Obama commutes sentence of Chelsea Manning. How many people died because of Manning's leak? That was from Judith Miller, the writer, the journalist. She wrote that in the New York Times. Controversial tweet, and it provoked a firestorm of a response. Aki Peretz, did Judith Miller have a right to try to blame Manning for deaths in Iraq?
Well, one of the things I think is important to say, if Judith Miller says that a lot of people died, well, then the question is who died and under what circumstances? We hear about Chelsea Manning's efforts in Iraq, but really what your previous guest talked about was all these State Department cables that came out, whether it's Afghanistan and elsewhere. How many people were directly affected by these efforts? Chelsea Manning basically gave up things at the secret level in the government classification system. A secret is considered serious damage, but it's not top secret, which is considered grave damage to the United States government. And you actually saw, if you actually parse through a lot of the State Department cables, you will saw U.S. diplomats basically doing exactly what you think they're doing. They're criticizing individuals and countries for doing bad things. They're meeting with human rights people. They're meeting with other ambassadors. They're going about the usual humdrum nature of what world diplomacy is. And if you sort of look at what Judith Miller says and said people died because of Chelsea Manning, I would say, who?
Aki, did people die because of Judith Miller when she wrote about WMDs that didn't exist?
That is a great question. I would suggest that absent Judith Miller, we probably still would have gone to war with in Iraq, and we would have invaded Iraq because the folks in the White House really wanted a conflict in the Middle East in 2002, 2003.
Ibrahim, did people die because of Chelsea Manning?
No, I can't find any cause and effect because of Chelsea Manning downloading a lot of documents and then uploading them onto WikiLeaks, that there's a correlation between information being released and people being killed. No.
Ahmed, when you saw that the sentence was commuted 28 years early by President Barack Obama, and he also said, you heard it in the report just preceding the discussion, that they felt this was too much. While it was a fair ruling, it was just too much. Was that an admission from the US president at the time that Chelsea Manning provided a valuable service to the United States?
Or it's just like a hidden things that have been done, is that you put them life sentence, at the same time you're going to use what Manning did in a way that pushing the American forces outside Iraq. Now, this is politics, of course, but how much Iraq get damaged from this political movement? At the end, I have people killed in Mosul, so many people killed in Mosul, in Anbar, and Diyala, and Salah ad-Din, and even Daesh came to Abu Ghraib in the west of Baghdad. They reached Baghdad. All these huge damages shouldn't consider for what's happened in 2010. I think it should be considered. It should be reviewed. At the end, is the decision at that time was right or wrong? And what are the impacts that happen after that decision should be also be viewed by the Americans and by the Iraqis and even by the international community, just to get a lesson, is that the correct decision should be for the benefit of win-win theory. It cannot be only for one person, or let's say one party, to win in the elections, to have something that it will damage the whole country and even the whole reputation of the American forces at that time.
And do you want American forces back in your country now that Daesh are in the country? You have Shia militias roaming the country, trying to fight Daesh, claiming to fight Daesh, but also hurting many civilians who happen to be of the other sect. The central government has little control of the country. Do you want Americans back in your country?
I want the international community to get their own responsibility of what's happening in Iraq, because terrorism already, well, blessed everywhere, even in the United States, in France, in London, in everywhere. At the end, if the international community get their own responsibility, that means it's not only the military actions will happen in the Iraq soil, but also to rehabilitate the Sunni community and have a healthy community that has three main tasks: fighting terrorism as a Sunni community, secondly, sit down with the partner on the national wise, and thirdly, have a good regional and international relations, which reaching a healthy state of the community, of the Sunni community, that at the end there will be the real damage for Daesh and another for the Daesh and for the militia, because the fight until now in Iraq didn't manage to have the final solution, which must the international community has its own responsibility on it.
Okay, and Aki, is there any appetite in Washington to be a part of a plan like that?
Well, it's actually quite interesting that your guest talks about the international community doing a lot of the fighting and a lot of the dying. When people talk about the international community, it really means the United States, because who else is the international community? The Europeans don't have a military who's willing, and they certainly don't have the political will to go in and fight a ground war in Iraq. Who else is there? The Russians, the Chinese.
Good point.
The only other international partner is Iran, which obviously the United States does not get along with.
Okay, so Ahmed, are you basically calling for American troops back in your country, but you're trying to say it in a more palatable way so it doesn't sound so unpopular? So you're saying international community. You want American forces, don't you? They make up the bulk of the troops.
I don't need, let's learn from the lesson. It's not only the military forces. It must be collaborated with other sectors. We are talking about rebuilding of the whole society. That means I need it on the military level, on the political level, on the economical level, and also for the social level. At the end, Iraq has so many crises. It's not only the military, it's not only security. We have corruption, we have economical crisis, we have social crisis. We need to stabilize things. We need to make a real formation of national reconciliation. That's why that's why I said the international community, because it's not only military. We need all these efforts to combine together to have a real solution on Iraq, because at the end, if Iraq didn't get from its crisis, that means everyone will have, it will spread in the global way.
Okay, understood clearly. Now, I want to shift focus very slightly. We're getting quite granular into Iraq. I want to talk a little bit about WikiLeaks itself, because I find it fascinating, Ibrahim, that a lot of the focus went away from Chelsea Manning, the initial leaker. It went on to WikiLeaks. While Manning was in jail, WikiLeaks developed its own personality, became its own thing. How did it change perceptions of Manning, perceptions of the Iraq War, that WikiLeaks went on and became something else and became quite unpalatable for many other people when you had Assange and his multiple scandals, his opinions on different wars and so on? How did that evolution or devolution change things, Ibrahim?
So, as of Chelsea's revelation, I think WikiLeaks was like the Abu Ghraib scandal. It gave a graphic image that we could associate with the American presence in Iraq. By the time with the Snowden documents, you see it becomes a geopolitical pawn, in that it could release documents, but documents now that, let's say, Russia and China would covet or see some kind of advantage in having documents being released. And then you see it having kind of a two-sided, being like a double-edged sword, let's say, in the American elections, so that you could have Trump calling Manning an ungrateful traitor for releasing these documents onto WikiLeaks. At the same time, he was more than happy to have these documents be a repository of the hacked correspondence of the Democratic National Convention. So we see it's evolved. It's become kind of something that's coveted. It's become a player in geopolitics, not only on the geopolitical level, but then affects also domestic American politics.
Yeah, and this is fascinating. So, Aki, you have this, you have this soldier. She's 5'3" tall, very sort of low-key, very shy personality, and so on. This was the initial source. And then you have WikiLeaks, on the other hand, who's this global player, as Ibrahim mentions it. Is it as big as Ibrahim mentions it to be? Is it a major player on the world scene, Aki?
It is. WikiLeaks is a major player on the world scenes because the Russians has supersized and made it extremely powerful. It's basically used as a propaganda effort for the Russians, and the Russians have other avenues for discussion, including DC leaks, the supposed Gucci for 2.0, to push out and hurt other countries. These include, it's funny, after the election, and I'm sure people can talk about the elections here and how WikiLeaks tried to influence it, but as soon as that was over, then it tried to influence the Germans' elections, and then we saw it in the French elections. We saw a lot of information being pushed out, let's say, on Turkey, because supposedly it was in Russia's best interest to do so. And so the organization has really morphed into a voice for Russian strategic interests. And Julian Assange is the kind of individual who has, for better or for worse, has become a patsy for Moscow.
Okay, that's an interesting opinion. It's a strong opinion, and WikiLeaks would defend themselves vehemently against that, which gives me the idea, Aki, I want to invite you back on the show so you can hopefully debate WikiLeaks.
Sure.
That'll be really good. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. All these years on, if it wasn't for Manning, we wouldn't have had WikiLeaks. We wouldn't have had Snowden. We wouldn't have had the NSA leaks. It's been an extraordinary decade or so. Chelsea Manning is free. Debate rages on about WikiLeaks and the Iraq war as well. Gentlemen, unfortunately, I've got to wrap this now because I have to move on. Aki Peretz, Ahmed Rushdie, and Ibrahim Al-Marashi. It's been good to talk to all of you.